President Donald Trump, the master deal maker, has vilified NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and vilified the companies that have moved their production to Mexico for stealing American jobs.
The car business is being abused more than most other businesses, right? And a lot of the business comes from overseas, and a lot of the business that you have is now moving to Mexico. I want those cars made in Michigan. I want those cars made here, right? Right?
Bringing back jobs is a familiar call for elections all around the world. But the data shows that President Trump may actually be right, that Americans, and Canadians as well, have lost their jobs to Mexico. NAFTA was supposed to be good for all three economies. So why the fading imprint of the auto and parts industry in Canada? Canada and the US have long had a relatively balanced trading relationship in this industry, well before NAFTA. In fact, going back to the Auto Pact, a bilateral free trade automotive agreement signed way back in 1965.
Canada and the United States trade more with each other than any other two countries. Indeed, about 1/5 of your exports go to Canada. And automobiles and parts constitute the largest single category in that trade.
When NAFTA first went into force in 1994, Mexico's workforce was seen as subpar and unlikely to compete for the highly skilled tasks required in auto parts manufacturing.
This is NAFTA at work. Expensive Canadian technology, a big U.S. parent, and cheap Mexican labor.
But what happens when Mexican manufacturers' productivity catches up? The Canadian Auto Workers Union says that's when the Mexican option becomes a threat to Canadian workers.
And that's exactly what has happened over the last 25 years. Thanks to automation and investment in new facilities, the Mexican workforce has caught up. But their wage rates haven't, providing attractive profit margins for those companies who locate there.
At the beginning, we were just doing assembly. Now we do assembly and machining of components. We do some very complex components here that 7 years ago we thought we would never relocalize in Mexico.
And we're now seeing the impact. Canadian vehicle assembly peaked in 1999 with 3 million vehicles built in that year. Today, Canada produces around 2.3 million units, roughly the same number it did when NAFTA first came into effect. Since the recession, the industry has closed a number of Canadian plants, despite huge taxpayer-funded bailouts paid to General Motors and Chrysler to maintain their Canadian operations. Meanwhile, vehicle production in Mexico has more than tripled under NAFTA. By 2008, Mexico surpassed Canada in total vehicle assembly and now produces 50% more vehicles than Canada. Before NAFTA, Mexican vehicle production accounted for 7% of the North American market. It now accounts for over 20% of that market and is expected to climb even higher. While Canada still produces marginally more vehicles than are sold in the country, Mexico, on the other hand, has become an export platform where over 70% of the vehicles made in the country are sold in the United States. As a result, America's trade deficit with Mexico in vehicles and parts has soared and is over 3 times the size of America's sectoral trade deficit with Canada.
We want to build, create, and grow more products in our country using American labor, American goods, and American grit. No longer are we going to allow other countries to break the rules, steal our jobs, and drain our wealth. And it has been drained. It has been drained.
Technically, Mexico hasn't done anything wrong, and neither have the companies like Canadian firm Magna that have moved their production there. After all, they're only maximizing profits by using much lower cost Mexican labor, which NAFTA both permits and indeed encourages them to do so. But President Trump calls that an unfair trade deal and vows to renegotiate it. If President Trump's goal is to see the return of domestic manufacturing and balance trade between America and its trading partners, then it's Canada who is far more likely to meet those requirements than Mexico. Labor costs in Canada and the US are basically comparable, in comparison to Mexico's wage rates that are less than a fifth those found north of the border. Similarly, trade between Canada and the U.S. is relatively balanced compared to the large and growing deficit the U.S. runs with Mexico. While the Canadian government has said early on that it would seek a common front with Mexico in renegotiating NAFTA, when it comes to the auto industry, Canadian and Mexican interests are not really aligned. Canada should carefully consider a separate bilateral trade agreement with the U.S. that ensures the continuation of duty-free trade between the two nations in the sector and enhances the competitiveness of Canadian plants and jobs. Otherwise, a continuation of the status quo under NAFTA will bring an inevitable downsizing of the Canadian industry and a further loss of middle-income jobs.